So with that, I would, we have had very interesting, presentation by both Niranjan and Chinky's ground, analysis of how elections work. I will draw your attention to another aspect of how democracies die, not because somebody stands up in a nation and says we should kill democracy. Nobody is going to tell you that, right? Even the worst of demagogue will not say that we are going to kill democracy. Not the worst of bigot is going to tell you that we will kill secularism. So the question is, when nobody says this, why do these systems come into crisis? When nobody in India is saying that we are against democracy. If I were to put an vote here, that how many of you support democracy, I'm 100% sure that it will be 100% that we'll all say democracy, we are in favor of democracy. Yet democracy in India is in crisis. This is the paradox that we need to understand, that democracies don't die an upfront death. Democracies die a slow death. And the slow death is caused because those who kill democracy offer you arguments that are at the surface level that look legitimate, that look reasonable. That is the whole crisis of how democracies enter into crisis. So I will present before you 4 or 5 such dominant arguments that we have had in the last 10 years, which at the face of it look like they're very democratic, they're very accountable, but how each one of us gets sucked into that vortex of these arguments. And then that's when we all willingly or unwillingly begin to contribute towards death of democracy. One of the first arguments that was presented in the last 10 years was a classical argument of electoralism. If we have won the elections with a majority, there is no other check that is possible on us, or there should be no other check on us. Who is judiciary to hold us accountable when people have elected us? What is constitution if we have direct popular sovereignty and support of the people? Look, on the face of it, this is such an effective argument. This is in classical terms called electoralism, that you reduce entire democratic process to getting elected, to gaining the majority, right? But if you watch closely, it is the same regime, it is the same set of leaders who will then follow up this argument by saying elections are actually an impediment to development. Therefore, they follow it by saying one nation, one election. That India cannot afford to have repeated elections. Having too many elections, too many times, is an impediment to development. There is a fiscal crisis. There is too much of chaos. So suddenly, election becomes an impediment to development. Election becomes an impediment to good policy making. Election becomes an impediment to efficiency. So if you take each of these arguments at face value, they look pretty convincing. The trick, therefore, for us as citizens is to read in between the lines, is often to read against the grain. What does this mean? Unless we don't do that as conscious citizens, especially those of you who are in this college education, those of you who are invested, your future is invested in democracy, you will have to learn to read things against the grain. If you follow things at the face value, then you will never know why democracy or how democracies will die. By the time you are into your 30s, 40s, India may not remain a democracy. If you look back, without your knowledge, you would have contributed to this. Because those of you think India should have faster development, faster growth, you would think election is an impediment. Those of you think democracy means elections, you would think any government which gets such a massive majority of 300 plus seats, why should they not have a free hand to do what they will? Otherwise, what is the meaning of getting majority, right? So that's the first between electoralism and elections as a problem. The second major issue that came up in last 10 years is a certain kind of a conceptual collapse between majority and majoritarianism. Liberal democracies across globe, and especially since in India we followed the first past post system, the moment a government has a majority, even if you have 51%, the other has 49%, the one which gains 51% comes into the government, right? That's the majority logic. So you can ask a very legitimate question. What is the meaning of this majority if it is not majoritarian? What does it mean? Because if the majority has voted to a certain government, why should that government not represent the will of that majority? So today, if that majority is being generated through an electoral process with certain religious majority, what prevents a government? What is so unethical? What is so wrong if that government wishes to legitimately represent a majority? So this is a very tricky question, right? That on the face of it, perhaps there is nothing actually unethical for a government. But then we will soon add that democracy actually means multiculturalism, democracy means secularism, democracy means minority rights. But we really do not find a justification from where do these other concerns come when the majority actually want a majoritarian order. So where do we draw? I think in the last 2 decades, not only in India, but this has now come up globally, that the distinction between majority and majoritarianism is in a certain kind of a conceptual, and to put it in theoretical terms, certain kind of an epistemic crisis. I was recently reading literature on multiculturalism. Some of you might be taught multicultural literature. Tanveer is here. Now there is a new literature on the rights of the majority. That why does multiculturalism only discuss the rights of minorities? Why not think about a majority culture? And why should majority culture not have? These are the new questions that are emerging globally. So democracies are also getting undermined, not just because somebody is standing and killing democracy, because democracies are getting, because of this conceptual slippery ground on which we are skidding, that we really do not know what should be an effective argument. Therefore, we have only constitutional arguments, legal arguments, that there has to be certain minority rights. But if a majority in a country decides, no, it is our culture which should get precedence, or state should take an ethnic character of the dominant majority group, is there anything inherently undemocratic? It might be unconstitutional, but is there anything undemocratic? It is a very, very conceptually thick question. I think we need to sit and put our heads. I don't think we have ready-made answers to the nature of crisis in democracy, because this crisis that we are going through post-2000 all over the world, what we are referring to as the rise of populism, I think populist governance, populist mobilization is framing altogether fresh kind of questions for us to address. Therefore, these kinds of meetings should not merely be in terms of either, praising or criticism, but to open up these new spaces. The kind of questions that were emerging, that, if a majority stands up and said, we need to be represented in the state culture, what is the other justification other than, because even Ambedkar said constitutional morality does not exist, you have to construct. And if a majority in a nation decides not to respect constitutional morality, is not convinced by constitutional morality, how do you proceed? And is that necessarily a crisis of democracy? Is it crisis of something else? We don't know. We'll have to re-question ourselves, go back to the scratch and rebuild arguments that are effective enough to buttress what we mean by democracy. Because if democracy is solely based on majority principle, then one might stand back and say that what is happening anywhere under populist authoritarian regimes is not undemocratic. It might be unconstitutional, but it might be unethical. It might be anti-human, it might be unsecular, but may not necessarily be anti-democratic. Similarly, the third question that has come up all over the world is a certain collapse or a shift from democracies throwing up processes of representation. It has moved to a process of identification. Today, leaders don't represent us. We fully identify with the leader. So Lavas already cautioned, as Ambedkar said, hero worship in democracy should not exist. That's a normative question. That's a question of ought. But if majority of people identify with certain leaders, deep emotive identification, which leads to greater participatory spirit. Representation is one where you have a certain mediated relation with the leader. What populists all over the world are doing is an unmediated relation, that we will put aside media, we will put aside parliament, we will put aside debates of legislature. We directly link to the and connect with the people, right? Now, this is another conceptual question. What is the democratic social character of this identification? Whether we like it or not, it's happening, right? You might give a normative critique, no, this is very dangerous. But we'll have to explain from bottom up of how people are visualizing this identification, especially post-globalization. That nation states are in crisis. There is a crisis of sense of belonging. There is a cultural sense of crisis of belonging, that globalization, the speed with which globalization is happening. People everywhere are going back asking basic question, who are we, where have we come from, what is our civilization? If a leader from somewhere pops up and says, I bring you that civilizational ethics, I remind you of our ancient civilizational roots, people are feeling a deep sense of belonging. So the greater question here is democracies. If you read John Keene's book, The Shortest History of Democracy, he makes an excellent point. He makes two fundamental points. He says, what is democracy? He says, democracy, one, is a friend of innovation, and democracy is about contingency. That is, democracies are based on innovating newer forms of social life. It is not to be stuck in tradition. Democracy is always about, he calls about, it is about denaturing power. That is, to distinguish power from your fundamental ascriptive identities of caste, gender, ethnicity, so on and so forth, right? So this needs a certain kind of an ethic to be innovative, to be open, to be multicultural, to be cosmopolitan. Today we have come a full circle where people are asking, what is the sense of belonging? So bigger question is, can democracies offer a deeper sense of belonging to people? Can constitutions offer a deeper sense of rooting in cultural ethos? I think these are fundamentally different questions we are facing under populist regimes. That the crisis of democracy is not just because somebody is assaulting, because democracies all over the world are failing to give people a sense of belonging, a deeper sense of rootedness. That's because democracy is fundamentally based on this ethic of expanding multiculturally, becoming more inclusive, include the stranger, include newer kinds of cultural questions, include new personalities, include sexual minorities. That's the beauty of democracy. But today, people are feeling threatened by that kind of innovation. People are feeling uprooted by contingency. And therefore, demagogues come and root themselves and say that we will give you that rootedness. We will give you that great sense of belonging. We will give you that great sense of civilizational longevity, a long civilizational memory. These are great things to say to people, because these are, I think, fundamentally it resonates with people's deeper sense of cultural identity, cultural belonging, right? Then we might ask, then what happens to other forms of culture? How inclusive will be this discourse of civilizational culture if you begin to then ethnicize and make it belong to only one kind of religious ethics, right? So we'll have to then, therefore, we'll have to address this question, whether it is a question of crisis of democracy and what is the role of elections within that, through some of these larger questions of conceptual distinctions, which I think have taken the democratic discourse in a completely different way. And some of the demagogues that we are finding globally, the populist demagogues, I think are running themselves. They find continuous legitimacy, they find certain resonance on the ground, because they are able to push one side of this discourse. They're at least giving us an optics of finding a resolution to some of this crisis, right? But from our theoretical experience, we can argue that this is dangerous in the long term to democracy. Elections can also be scuttled. We are seeing that what is happening with SIR, compromise elections. We began with electoralism, we are now ending up with compromise elections. So this is the line we are going to take. But we cannot convince a majority in this country, or any country for that matter, unless we answer that this violation of electoral norms happens behind the legitimacy they gain from cultural arguments, from civilizational arguments, sense of belonging. That legitimacy comes from somewhere else. How do we fuse these two is, I think, the million-dollar question for your generation. I'll stop here. Thank you.